What we're going to do in this exercise is make a simple scarf for IMVU to familiarize ourselves with Atelier. So this is an alternative to Marvelous Designer for clothing creation and essentially functions the same way. So let's just take a quick look at the interface. So on the left hand side we've got the pattern view where we draw out our patterns that make up our clothing item. On the right we have the preview and simulation window where we simulate our clothing on a prop or avatar. Each has their own display options relative to the functionality of the view. Running across the top we have the main tools that are used for creating clothing. And each one of these performs a different function based on the operation that's being carried out. On the right, we have the properties panel. So this is where the properties for whatever is selected can be edited, viewed, or modified. For example, the 3D mesh, we can change the properties of the mesh, we can change materials, and other such things. So let's get started on our project, and we'll get to each of the tools as and when we need them. So first thing we want to do is just load in an avatar. This has been pre-configured, pre-saved, and ready for use by just being loaded in. So open avatar. Avatar, browse to the location of our file, and it will be an SAVT file. That's a proprietary format. Select and just open. So this will bring up an import or open dialog. Because it's using the properties that are saved in the file, we don't need to edit any of these, so just click OK. And there is our avatar. So the basics of manipulating and moving around. This is using the default settings for Atelier. They can be changed to suit your preferences, but the defaults are middle mouse strafes, so that's left, right, up, down, both views. Middle mouse scroll zooms, both views, and then right click rotates just the 3D view. It doesn't do anything in the 2D view. Left click allows us to select meshes in the 3D view and pattern shapes in the 2D view. So if we had some patterns in here, we would be able to left click and select them. And that's the basics. So middle mouse moves, right click rotates, left click selects. So now that we've got our avatar in place, let's drop in a pattern, and for that we need to use the pattern options. So rectangle is the default, but if we click to expand, we have rectangle, oval, and other shapes. So we just want rectangle. Click the button. That activates the tool. And then all we do is left click drag and draw out a shape in the pattern editor. Release, and that sets our pattern in place. So in the 2D view, the pattern editor, the avatar silhouette that we can see, just allows us to proportion, scale, size the pattern shapes relative to the avatar. And obviously in the 3D view, this is where we do the positioning and simulation of the shape. Now to select, as mentioned before, we want to be in select move, so that disables or disengages the active tool. So activate that, and we have the manipulation widgets. This allows us to scale and change the size. So if we left click drag, we can change the size of our patterns, move them around, scale uniformly or scale linearly. Like so, and that gives us the widget in the 3D view. So in the 2D view, we're only moving the pattern on the XY, so either up, down, left, right, or variations on that. In the 3D view, the widget now allows us to position our scarf where we want it to be, which will be at the back of the avatar's head. It's worth noting that the widget's location, its position on the mesh, is context sensitive. So if we click somewhere else on the mesh, what this means is that the widget will position, move, manipulate the mesh relative to that pivot point that is set. So let's just undo that, Control Z. So when we want to position things, make sure that we are clicking where we want the pivot point to be located. So let's just move that, like so. Let's shrink this down a little bit, like so. So that's the basics of moving our patterns, our shapes, in the pattern editor and the 3D view. So right now, all we've done is positioned the mesh where it needs to be in order to create the scarf. So this will obviously eventually be a wrap around the avatar's neck. To do that, we want to enable simulation. So if we click on the button now, the fabric falls to the ground. That's because there's nothing holding the mesh in place when it's not actually contacting the avatar or the prop or whatever it is that we're using to wrap our cloth around. So how do we do that? Well, we use pins. And what that allows us to do is place a point on our mesh which acts as a lock, which locks it in position, so when the simulation is run again, the cloth deforms relative to this point. So if we turn off simulation, reset our mesh, so right click, we want reset 3D arrangement selected, or Control F, the shortcut key. That will reset the mesh back to where it was. And if its position has been adjusted, we can just put it back to where it needs to be. Ready for pinning. So, enable the pin tool. This will show the structure of the mesh, which is basically a triangle soup. And what we want to do here is drop a pin on one of these points. These are the mesh vertices. If we mouse over a point, we can see that there's a highlight on the mesh and a highlight on the pattern. Both of these positions correspond to one another. So let's click that and drop in a point. That gives us a highlight. There's now also a highlight on the pattern. So again, these two correspond to each other. So now if we just do a quick simulation, we'll see that the fabric moves relative to that pin. So let's stop that and reset the mesh. Select, right click the mesh, reset. So with that initial pin in place, we can now take a look at editing the simulated cloth. So let's just enable the simulation and then edit the mesh. So with the simulation active, if we left click drag the cloth, it will essentially just fall back into its simulated position because there's nothing blocking or resisting it. And moving this into position is tricky because we are relying on the physics simulation to be able to manipulate the mesh. So what we can do here is again use pins, dropping a couple at the end of the scarf in this particular example, which we can use as manipulation control points. So if we drop one there and we drop one there, so that's clicking, we can now select those points each now is highlighted with a widget that we can then use to position the simulated cloth. Now, whilst we've got pin active, and we can select and move these pins, if we want to manipulate the rest of the mesh, we have to switch to select move. That disengages the pin, otherwise we would be marking pins all over the mesh. So let's just drop that down there. But whilst we are in this mode, we can still move the pins. So I'll just take a few moments to do this. Shaping our mesh as we go. Like so. And that will be our scarf. So if we want to have more control over the mesh, we can add more pins at strategic locations. So for example, on either side of the neck, so that we have greater control over how the mesh deforms around the back of the neck. But that will be our scarf. Right, so let's stop the simulation. So let's save the project. So File, Save as Project. Scarf, brackets 1. So this is saving as an sproj, S-P-R-O-J file. Save. Now let's say we wanted to add some tassels to the end of this scarf. How would we do that? So in the pattern editor, we want the, in this case again, the rectangle tool. All we're going to do is just draw out a shape. Select move. We don't necessarily need to move this into position. But there is the object. So that's what we've just drawn out. But what we need to do now is stitch this to the bottom of the scarf mesh. So for that, we need to use segment sewing. So if we enable that, we'll get a highlight. So what we do is click on the edge we want to sew, and then on the edge that we want to sew to, like so. That seam then appears in the 3D view. And to get this into position, we don't necessarily need to move it, as mentioned. All we need to do is re-simulate the fabric. And as we can see, it's connected, and it's connected in the way that it would actually do, because what we've done is created a seam between this small edge and this longer edge. So what we need to do is break this long edge up into sections so that the seam on this edge can be connected to a shorter edge on this longer edge. And we do that using Edit Curve. This will allow us to drop in a point that we can then right click on and convert to an endpoint. So basically this is similar to subdividing an edge in Blender. So right click, convert to endpoint. So again, Edit Curve, drop in a point, right click, convert. So we can do this and subdivide this edge. Then what we need to do is adjust Edit Sewing, select that edge, right click, delete. Enable segment sewing and rebuild that segment. Click, click. If we run the simulation on this one, it'll now properly simulate. So all we need to do is draw out some more segments. Let's do them at slightly different lengths. Just for illustrative purposes. Segment sewing, edge to shorter edge, edge to shorter edge, edge to shorter edge. Simulate, and there they all are in place. So we can adjust these. Edit pattern. We just click and manipulate. So this allows us to make adjustments to the mesh. Let's just drop in another node. Edit the sewing. So it's that edge. So right click, delete, and then rebuild. So now we've got a gap between each of these tassels. So let's resimulate. And there is the adjusted scarf end. So we can repeat that on the other side. Four tassels. 1, 2, 3, 4. Edit curve. Click. Right click. Click to place. Right click. Convert. Click to place. Right click. Convert. Segment sew. And then resimulate. And there are our tassels. So let's save this. Save what we've got so far. So file, save as, project number 2. Okay, so that's the mesh. So the basics are, once we've dropped in our avatar, we use the pattern tool to drop in the shapes that we want into the pattern editor. We can then simulate that in the 3D view to find out how the shape will form or fall around the avatar, if it does by default, based on where it's positioned. We can then use pins to pin and shape the mesh using strategically placed pin controls which then allows us to manipulate the mesh much more easily, even though simulation is active. So we are adjusting and modifying the mesh in real time using the pins as our control points. So once we've got all of that in place, we can edit the material. So by default, there is a default fabric material assigned to the mesh. We can edit the properties of this by selecting it. So we want to make sure that we are in Select Move. Select it in the Properties panel, and then we want to be in the Property Editor and the Material section. And here, for a very basic material, we can edit the texture and the color properties of the material. So if we change color first, so click on the sampler, we can then set a color, click dragging, and then click OK to set that in place. So that gives us a base color for our mesh. If we want to assign an actual image to this in texture, we click on the plus button. This opens the default Windows browser where we browse to our image. Where we can select one. So click, open, and that automatically assigns it to our mesh, which is also obviously color tinted. If we don't like this selection, we can click on the trash can and that will remove it, and then we just repeat the process to add a different image, like so. For IMVU, those are the basic materials that need to be set, so texture and or color. There are other maps for IMVU. That would be normal map and gloss map, which translates into shininess. So let's save this before we go any further. Save as project number 3. So what about the detail of the mesh? So right now, if we go into Fabric and enable 3D Mesh, we can see the structure of the mesh. Let's make this a little easier to see. So select the material. Let's just get rid of the image and set the material back to white. So that's our mesh structure. What if we want a denser mesh and or a more detailed mesh? For that, we need to select the mesh. In the Properties Editor, we've got some properties that are associated specifically with the mesh. And to increase the density, we want particle distance. The default is 20. So if we want to increase the density of the mesh, we need to decrease the particle distance. So click type, let's type 10, and that increases the density. So that's more mesh structure. If we want to decrease, we type a higher number. So let's go with 30. So that decreases the density of the mesh. Let's go back down to 10. What we can also do, and this only affects the selected mesh because these are not actually physically connected. They are stitched. So these are all independent mesh objects. So each one of these needs to be treated the same in order to get the mesh to match up across all the objects. So shift click for multiples and then change them all at the same time. What we can also do, because we generally want to be working with square faces or quads rather than triangles, which just makes the process easier for prepping for IMVU once we get this into Blender or 3D Studio Max. So what we want to do here again is select the mesh, and in properties again, scroll down, and we want miscellaneous. And here we have mesh type. Right now it's showing a triangle. If we click on that, we've got two other options: quad basic, which will convert the entire mesh into square faces, and quad. The difference between the two is generally how complex the mesh is. So if we go back to quad basic, we might notice that there is a collapse of a quad at this point. So that's an optimization. So quad basic will partially optimize the mesh, whereas quad will try and retain quads for the entire structure. If we do that again for all the other ones, so select them all, triangle, quad, we can then run the simulation again, just to ensure that these changes propagate. And they do, because we've increased the density of the mesh, which allows us or affords us more detail to our fabric. Let's deactivate and then rebuild the material. So texture, plus button, browse to the file, and the color. Okay. And then we're almost ready to export. So just to recap, what we've done is selected the material that's assigned to our mesh. So this material is assigned to all the meshes that we've added to the scene. And then we've changed the material info, the texture, and color properties. Let's save this. Then export. So for that, we want to select the mesh, everything that we're going to export, we want to select everything. So shift click. And then right click and freeze it. This will lock its position. That freezes everything. This just ensures that there are no changes during the export process. So this mesh will be exported as is in this frozen position. And then all we do is File, Export, FBX. In this case, we're using FBX because that's what can be imported into Blender with ease. So File, Export, FBX. Save location, that's okay. Save. We'll get an export dialog, and in this case, all we want is the patterns. So we don't need the props and we don't need the avatar. So all we have is just the clothing item. All the other options are okay because we're only exporting a simple mesh object. So we can leave all of these as is. And then just export. So now we have an FBX file we can import into Blender for prepping IMVU. So in Blender, as we are importing content from a third-party application, we basically want to be importing it into a clean default scene. We don't want the toolkit active just yet. So in that clean scene, we just want File, Import, FBX. So File, Import FBX. Browse to the location of our file, Scarf 4, select, check the properties. These are all okay, that's all right. We want to disable animation and there should be no armature info, so that's okay. And then just import FBX. So that will bring the file in, but we may not see it. If we don't, we can double check in the outliner for a new object instance. In this case, that's cloth piece. So there is something in the scene, but we can't see it. So let's hide the cube. Let's select cloth piece in the outliner. And then from view, we can do frame selected. This will zoom in on the parent object of the item we've exported from Atelier, because the mesh will be parented to it. And there is our clothing item, but it's very small. So what we want to do is in Object Properties or View Sidebar, we can check the scale of this object, this empty object. And what we can do is make sure that's selected and then change the scale from 0.01 to 1 on the X, Y, and the Z axes. So this basically resets our object to the right scale. There is our object correctly rescaled. If we go into Material Preview, we should see our image assigned to our object, which has obviously been blended, merged with the color that we assigned to the material. So now that we've got that imported, we can save the file. File, save as. Scarf Blender 1. Save as. Now before we do anything with this, we need to do a little bit of prep to make sure that it's going to work correctly with IMVU, with the toolkit. So first thing we need to do is, if we select the origin and move that, the mesh will move with it, because the mesh is parented to this as a control object. This acts as the origin of this entire object group. So what we want to do is select everything and clear the parent relationship of the meshes from this empty object, because we need to be able to use just the meshes on their own. So with those selected, shift click 1 to make it the active object. We want object, parent, clear and keep transform. So we want to clear the parent relationship between all the objects. So clear and keep transform. And what that will do is separate all the mesh objects into their own individual element. So now the empty object doesn't control the mesh. Next step for prepping is to select all the mesh parts, shift click the scarf to make it the active object, and we're just going to join all of these together. So object, join. So we're creating a single unified mesh, like so. If we just quickly go into solid view, we can see we just need to do a little bit of editing. So object mode, edit mode, because these faces are not linked to one another. We need to make sure that they are. So select all, and then mesh, clean up, merge by distance. We need to merge everything into a single mesh, and that will now mean that everything is joined together. Final step, object mode, object, shade smooth. So we just need to assign that just to make sure that everything is smoothed. And watch out for positioning 0, 0, 0. Material preview. There is our scarf ready to be prepped for IMVU by being appended into the clothing tool. So let's just save that, save as, to the final step is rename so that we know what we're looking at. So click scarf.mesh. Save the file. Right, so clothing tool. We need a new file. View, sidebar, IMVU toolkit, clothing tool. Pen clothing file. So we've got the male 1.5. We use the default male, so we need to change that to male. And then all we do is file, append, browse to our file that we saved, double click, we want object, double click, and there is our mesh. So click, the option defaults are okay, so then just append. That brings in our scarf, correctly sized and positioned relative to the avatar. So let's save this before we go any further. Save as. Number 4. And then we can prep this for IMVU. So now that we've got our scarf into Blender, what we need to do is link it to the armature so that when the armature articulates along with the avatar, the mesh moves with it, our scarf moves with it. And for that, we need to select the mesh. So we're in object mode, select the mesh. In the toolkit, click on Bind to Armature. That will bind the armature and the scarf clothing mesh together. So if we now select the armature and move it, we can see that our scarf moves with the avatar. And that's because, if we go back into object mode, that's because our scarf is now weight painted. So if we just click on the Paint Weight button, we can use vertex groups in Object Data Properties to select group and see, influence the color changing on the mesh based on influence each group has on the mesh. Now ordinarily we would then paint all of this, so we would have to manually, using the paint tools, weight it. We change the weight to increase the influence of a given bone, so in this case it's the head bone. We change the weight value to 1 for full influence over that particular vertex or area that we are painting on the mesh, or we reduce it to 0 to null the influence on a particular area of the mesh. That takes a long time, so a quick way of doing this is to select the torso mesh, then our avatar mesh, the avatar mesh, then our scarf, switch to weight paint mode, and then in the weights menu, we can transfer weights. So if we click on that, we'll get this little pop-up. And we might have noticed that the weights changed associated with the mesh. So if we want vertex groups, nearest vertex, object transform, everything else is okay. So what that now means is that we have a transference of the weights from the avatar mesh to our scarf. And that's generally more accurate than just using bind to armature. But we still may need to do some weight painting and adjustments because it's not perfect. And the reason for that, if we switch back to object mode, the reason for that, I'm going to solid mode, is this. So if we select the torso, object properties, viewport display, wireframe, select our scarf, same again, wireframe. So transferring weights doesn't always work as expected because there's a difference, a significant difference in this case, between the structure of the avatar mesh and the structure of, in this case, the scarf that's been brought in. The scarf is almost 3 times as dense as the avatar mesh. So what's actually happening when we transfer the weights is that if there's a structure like this, this vertex, the weights from that is going to be transferred roughly to this group of vertices on our scarf. And it's not precise, it's approximate. And it's the same with this section here. This vertex will be transferred to this section. So it basically means the weight values are all being transferred from a low resolution mesh to a higher resolution mesh in an approximate fashion. So there isn't necessarily always going to be a one-to-one correspondence, which basically means we're always going to need to do a little bit of tidying up with the weight painting. And that means selecting our mesh, clicking on the weight paint tool button, activating weight paint, selecting a group, so the neck groups are okay. Bicep, there's a little bit of influence there, so we're going to use the weight paint tool, zero that out, so click drag, paint that out. Elbow, and we need to remove the influence of all of these bones so that they don't pull on the mesh as it deforms, because we essentially only want the torso area influencing this essentially torso mesh. If these are influencing this mesh, it will be pulled out of shape, which is what we saw when we did the quick test earlier. Wrist and bicep. Paint all of that out. And this does take time. So what we'll do is come back to this with the weight painting completed. But if we do a quick test now, back into object mode, select the armature, we can click on the pose button or change the mode. Either or works. We can now articulate the skeleton, and we can already see that the mesh is deforming much better than it was before. So we need to add some influence for the hip bone to this section of the mesh and potentially the thigh bone. But everything else is more or less okay. So again, there's another bone influencing the mesh, which is pulling it or pushing it out of shape. Let's just reset the pose. So, as mentioned, we'll come back to this with it completed. Let's save. Save as. So we've finally got our mesh weight painted. So what we should find now is that our mesh articulates reasonably well with our avatar. And we may still get some clipping in the more extreme poses. We can make adjustments for that later if we need to, but that is our clothing item weight painted to the avatar. So let's save this file, save as 6. And then after all that work weight painting, all we need to do to export this, because now we have it all set up, is select, and in the toolkit we use the export button. So click on that, and because we prepped this and bound it to the armature using the bind to armature, this is why we're able to weight paint it. It's now exported an FBX file that we can now import into Studio. So in IMVU Studio we need to create a new project. We use the male avatar, so men, clothing, tops, and we want to derive from the empty male top. So select, derive, there is our avatar based on our inventory. So all we need to do now is import our FBX file. So import FBX, browse to our file. It will be a prepended because we use the clothing tool, clothing underscore. So select, open, go through the import process, set up FBX. So that's what it's found in the file. Set up FBX. Now we did not include the avatar torso with this, so this is essentially a layerable clothing item. So we need to use a mesh ID above the defaults. So let's just pick an arbitrary number. The other options are okay. Next. There's our material. Next. We don't need animation. This is the default test animation that's included in the clothing file, so we don't need to import that. So deselect, review. That's what it's going to bring in. Import. And there is our scarf auto-assembled. Now, because we've used a single layered mesh, our scarf's going to appear inside out in certain angles. So for this particular object, there's all our assets. We need to be in component. Make sure we're in material. There's our material. Material properties. There's our image. you need to scroll down and enable in properties double-sided. Activate that, preview, and there is our scarf. And obviously it's going to clip because the scarf was made relative to the naked avatar top, and we've got this sitting on top of another clothing item. So if we wanted this to be over the top of another item, so as a wearable item, we need to go back to Blender and make some adjustments to the mesh itself. This is not a weight painting issue, this is a mesh position issue. So we would need to edit the mesh physically to make adjustments so that we compensate for the mesh clipping through. So if we used a naked torso top, this wouldn't be an issue. But as this is a layerable item and it's layered over the top of another clothing item, we have to make sure that we compensate for that. But that is using our Atelier to create a simple scarf, exporting that to Blender for prep, and then exporting from Blender, IMVU, and assembly in Studio. So that is our simple scarf project. All we need to do is now save as Atelier scarf. And were we to be happy with this and it was okay, we'd be in the info tab, filling out the properties, and then submitting to the catalog. So from 3D Style Atelier to Blender, IMVU Studio.